The racial wealth divide beyond 2024. Looking past 2024 to 2043, when Americans of color are projected to outnumber white Americans, the declining wealth for Black and Latino households will account for a projected loss of an additional $11,000 in overall household wealth. At this rate, the country's median household wealth will be just $52,300 in 2043, 32% less than what it was in 1983. To be clear, there's no need to wait until then to know the impact of the racial wealth divide on the middle class. Overall median wealth of households today already falls short of the $68,000 threshold required to be considered middle class. Looking beyond 2043, the situations for households of color looks even worse. While these families are expected to sustain significant losses in wealth in the next few decades, they are actually projected to hit zero wealth just 10 years after people of color become the majority in the United States. If unattended, trends at the median suggest Black household wealth will hit zero by 2053. In the same period, median white household wealth is expected to climb to $137,000. The situation isn't much brighter for Latino households, whose median wealth is expected to reach zero by 2073, just 2 decades after Black wealth is projected to hit zero. By this time, the median wealth of white households is projected to have reached $147,000. For Black and Latino communities that already find themselves consistently on the edge of financial insecurity, this steep and steady slide to zero median wealth will only serve to compound the already sizable challenges facing these communities. Wealth is an intergenerational asset. Its benefits pass down from one generation to the next, and the consequences of these losses will reverberate deeply in the lives of the children and grandchildren of today's people of color. Of course, Black and Latino households having zero wealth isn't just an issue for future generations to be dealt with later. Already today, we have significant portions of these households owning zero wealth. As of 2013, 30% and 24% of Black and Latino households, respectively, had zero or negative net worth, amounting to 7.6 million households. Racial wealth inequality doesn't just plague Black and Latino families. Often, discussions about racial equity and economic inequality focus exclusively on Black and Latino communities. Even in this report, we have focused thus far on Black and Latino families and not other racial groups. In part, the focus on Black and Latino groups can be attributed to the fact that the economic insecurities facing these particular communities is much easier to see. However, the lack of compelling data about other racial and ethnic minorities should not be treated as evidence that they do not face mounting economic inequality. To the contrary, there are often significant gaps between their wealth and the wealth of their white counterparts. Declining Asian American wealth, the forgotten racial wealth divide. When it comes to Asian American communities, their struggles with economic inequality are often overlooked due to prevailing stereotypes and the oversimplification of economic data, which consolidates 21 million culturally diverse people from 48 countries, each with different context of immigration and wealth, into a single group. This consolidation further perpetuates the model minority myth of Asian households as being unequivocally better off than other communities of color. Beyond serving as a wedge in conversations about race and economic mobility, aggregating economic data about Asian American communities obscures clear social and economic differences within the Asian communities in the U.S., particularly when it comes to wealth. To this point, recent research by the Center for American Progress has found that overall affluence and economic well-being associated with Asian Americans is not shared across the entire community, and that, in fact, many face serious wealth inequality challenges. When economic data for Asian Americans are disaggregated, wealth inequality is actually more significant among Asian American households than compared to white households. For example, between 2010 and 2013, the top 10% of Asian Americans owned $1.4 million in wealth, while the bottom 20% of Asian Americans owned about $9,300. By comparison, the top 10% of white households owned $1.2 million, while the bottom 20% of white households owned a little more than $10,000. Overall, the richest Asian Americans held 168 times more wealth than the poorest Asian Americans, while the richest white households owned 121 times more wealth than the poorest white households. Although median Asian American households are generally more affluent than the median white households, these disaggregated data reveal both a greater concentration of Asian American households at the bottom and a highly skewed average due to wealth distributions at the top. For example, in addition to bringing further attention to the level of wealth inequality experienced within the Asian American community itself, researchers at the Center for American Progress found that the poorest Asian Americans own far less wealth than their white counterparts. Today, among households in the bottom half of the income distribution, white households owned more than twice the wealth held by their Asian American peers. All of these data point to a significant wealth divide between white and Asian American households over the past 25 years that is often overlooked. Declining Native American wealth. The unaccounted racial wealth divide. Not unlike Asian Americans, our collective focus on the social and economic issues facing Native Americans is also influenced in part by availability of and methods for collecting economic data that shed light on these communities. However, when it comes to Native American data, the issue for these communities is less often about how they are seen and more often about if they are seen. Whereas aggregated economic data about Asian households are often skewed, Native American economic data are often outdated, difficult to collect, and/or insufficient to interpret reliably. In turn, the unique economic experiences of Native Americans are often overlooked, even though these experiences tend to be comparable or worse than those for Black and Latino households. While we do have access to a range of current data on income, including median household income and poverty rates, when it comes to Native American net worth, scant data are available to illustrate the current state of wealth within these communities. In fact, when it comes to wealth, the most recent data available for Native American communities are 17 years old. In 2000, the last time Native American wealth was systematically measured, the median net worth of Native households stood at just $5,700. Ultimately, the problematic nature of data on Asian American wealth and the dearth of data on Native American wealth complicate our discussion of the racial wealth divide in three important ways. First, and most obviously, these challenges mean we lack the data needed to fully understand and therefore design solutions to the unique problems facing these communities. Second, and closely related, insufficient, unreliable, and aggregated data prevent us from seeing the full scope of the racial wealth divide and its inevitable impact on the middle class if left untreated. Third, and finally, in the absence of these data, we make generalizations about groups of people that not only perpetuate problematic narratives, such as of the model minority, but also fail to see the urgency with which some of our neighbors are suffering the effects of decades or centuries of economic exclusion. Hence, any solution to growing racial wealth inequality will demand that we also refine our abilities to collect and interpret data that shed light on the lived economic realities of these communities. How government policies built and preserve the racial wealth divide. Across most economic indicators, white families today fare significantly better than families of color. As scholars like Thomas Shapiro, William Sandy Darity, Derek Hamilton, Mariko Chang, and others have argued, this disparity is rooted in our social systems and structures, not in individual behaviors. And although emphasis has recently been placed on the role that public policies have played in the economic pain suffered by white working class communities, there is no shortage of evidence that public policies and practices throughout our history have worked to benefit white families at the expense of communities of color. Today, the legacies of these policies and practices have metastasized across the whole range of economic inequalities, leaving communities of color far short of their economic needs and unable to achieve financial security, let alone build wealth. Ultimately, how communities of color arrived at many of these and other harsh economic realities can be directly traced to institutional and pervasive racial discrimination across a series of systems, policies, and practices from our very beginnings throughout present day, which together have systematically worked in favor of the wealth building potential of white households at the exclusion and expense of the wealth building potential of communities of color. The foundation of the divide has deep roots in our national history. While the racial wealth divide can be largely attributed to the effects of discriminatory and exclusionary policies and practices put in place in the years after the Great Depression and World War II, the foundation for this divide had been forged long before we reached either of these points in our history. From the earliest days of our country's infancy through the late 19th century, a range of policies and practices laid the foundation for this divide include African chattel slavery and wage theft. Throughout the 246 years when slavery was an institution in the United States, the forced and free labor extracted from enslaved men, women, and children allowed white slave owners to accumulate massive amounts of wealth. To crystallize what this free labor meant to the wealth building potential of white slave owners and what it cost those who actually earned it, consider that by 1860, the lower Mississippi Valley, land about the size of Maine, had more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the United States. racially exclusive land redistribution. Through the Homestead Act, approximately 270 million acres, or about 10% of all land in the United States, was given to over 1.6 million homesteaders. Today, research finds 46 million adults, or about 20% of the U.S. population, can potentially trace their family's history of building wealth to this one public policy. Yet, despite the impact of the Homestead Act and the fact that it allowed for any adult, including Black adults, to claim a 160-acre parcel of land, it still disproportionately benefited white households. For example, African Americans who ran into a series of legal obstacles put in place by white Southerners to block former slaves from becoming property owners couldn't claim legal ownership of the land offered to them by the Homestead Act. Of course, we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that the Homestead Act was possible because of land stolen by the U.S. government from indigenous people, marking another dark spot in the long history of colonization, wars, genocide, deceptive practices, and forced expulsions that prevent Native peoples from thriving still today. Denying access to the asset of citizenship. The Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted in 1882, placing a 10-year ban on Chinese workers immigrating to the U.S. and naturalizing in order to appease economic and cultural concerns raised by white Americans at the time. In 1892, the Geary Act extended the original ban for another 10-year period before it was made permanent in 1902. As a result, these communities could not take advantage of land-owning opportunities or build long-term financial security because citizenship was often a requirement for owning property under the Homestead Act and state laws that mirrored it. The experience of Chinese immigrants is far from unique for communities of color, for whom denying the benefits of citizenship has more often been the rule than the exception. In fact, racially discriminatory immigration policy was the norm from 1790 until 1965, when it became illegal to deny people access to citizenship on the basis of their race. Still today, we see how immigration laws use race as a justification for discrimination, even if it is illegal to grant citizenship status on the basis of race. Early 20th century policies unleashed the racial wealth divide. Although the foundation of the racial wealth divide was laid during America's formative years, it wasn't until the first part of the 20th century when the racial wealth divide we have come to know today was accelerated. Three practices in particular contributed to this acceleration. Denial of Social Security to farm workers and domestic workers. In 1935, the groundwork for the nation's social safety net infrastructure was laid with the passage of the Social Security Act. Yet despite the significance and importance of the legislation, the Social Security Act of 1935 excluded a third of all American workers, including farm workers and domestic workers, who were predominantly people of color, from coverage under the legislation. For African Americans, the cost of exclusion from the Social Security Act of 1935 resulted in a loss of benefits totaling slightly over $143 billion in 2016 dollars. To be sure, white workers were also denied the benefits of Social Security to the tune of $461 billion, in fact. However, although white farm workers and domestic workers were excluded, African Americans and other minority workers bore the brunt of the impact as they comprised a much larger share of those excluded, about 2/3, compared to white workers. Federally sanctioned housing discrimination. Between 1934 and 1968, The Federal Housing Administration, along with public and private sector actors like the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, intentionally shut out households of color from the opportunity to purchase a home through the practice of redlining. Despite FHA's goal of making home ownership accessible to more American households, the underwriting practices it implemented during its first 35 years resulted in homebuyers of color receiving just 2% of the government-backed mortgages issued over that period of time. The practice of being denied access to traditional credit pushed many would-be homebuyers of color into wealth-stripping land contracts, a predatory and costly arrangement in which buyers paid an exorbitant price to purchase a home, and in which a missed payment would lead to eviction from the home and the loss of all equity. In cities like Chicago, where redlining was rampant, the practice of land contracts led African American families to pay an average of $20,000 more for their homes than the prices paid by white families, ultimately stripping more than $500 million in wealth from families of color over a 30-year period. Ultimately, this practice not only set the stage for home ownership to become the largest driver of the racial wealth divide today, it also shaped, figuratively and literally, the communities in which many people of color live today. Denial of economic opportunities for service members of color. By and large, the GI Bill of 1944 is credited with providing millions of returning World War II veterans with the opportunity to access wealth-building opportunities, including low-cost home mortgages, low-interest business loans, and tuition assistance. Although the bill did not include discriminatory language or directives, it delegated administrative authority to the states with minimal federal oversight. The result was pervasive racial discrimination in which service members of color were more likely to be denied access to a range of benefits that greatly expanded the American middle class that arose during the second half of the century. As with redlining, discriminatory lending practices among service members of color were prevalent, leaving veterans to face racially biased administrators that were unwilling to extend GI benefits, as well as banks that were unwilling to extend credit to people of color. For example, 3 years into the administration of the law, a survey of 13 Mississippi cities found that African American service members received just 2 of the 3,229 loans made by the Department of Veterans Affairs to support home ownership, businesses, and farming. Current public policies are preserving the racial wealth divide. Even though many policies and practices that have impacted the economic potential of communities of color have been outlawed or corrected, today there remains a whole host of policies and systems that either limit the ability of households of color from building wealth or strip away what little wealth they might have. The policies discussed below are just a few of the most enunciated examples. The punishment of our most vulnerable for trying to get ahead. Despite the fact that social safety net programs are designed with the explicit purpose of helping families climb out of poverty, many public benefits programs, in which households of color are more likely to participate than their white counterparts, punish families for even modest savings that might help them get ahead. These savings penalties are often called asset limits, and they limit eligibility for many means-tested government assistance programs to those with very little or no savings. In some states, as little as $1,000 in a savings account earmarked for a child's college education results in families losing access to critical public assistance programs like SNAP, or the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. Even owning a car, an asset that many workers need to get to their jobs, remain employed, and move off public assistance that is valued above a certain threshold can disqualify a family from these critical safety net programs. Although many states have taken advantage of the flexibility they have to lift or remove these penalties entirely, many other states have failed to leverage this flexibility, and there continue to be efforts at the federal level to take away that flexibility entirely. The perpetuation of financial insecurity by the criminal justice system. Today, 70 to 100 million Americans have a criminal record. Given that communities of color make up a disproportionate amount of the incarcerated population, and that these communities are more likely to interact with and be affected by the sprawling criminal justice system, its impact on the racial wealth divide cannot be ignored. For example, the debts generated by a system of fines and fees can often leave individuals who interact with this system in an unsettling economic situation, even after they have repaid their debts to society or have been cleared of any wrongdoing. In Washington, a state with lower incarcerations than 39 other states, criminal debt stripped 36 to 60% of the income from formerly incarcerated men. At the national level, the burden of more than $50 million in criminal debts are held by just 10 million people, or about 3% of the population. Unfortunately, criminal debts are often compounded further by a number of other challenges, including difficulties in securing employment. To this point, the American Bar Association has found that of the more than 46,000 collateral consequences or civil penalties of federal and state criminal convictions, 60 to 70% are employment related. An upside-down U.S. tax code that overwhelmingly favors wealth building for wealthy, mostly white, households over everyone else. Our tax code is, by leaps and bounds, the single largest tool the federal government uses to provide families with the support they need to boost economic outcomes and build lifelong wealth. To achieve these goals, the federal government spent $677 billion through the tax code in 2016 to help families purchase a home, go to college, and save and invest for the future. Together, this amount surpasses the budgets of all federal agencies combined, save for the Department of Defense. While the government's goal of helping families build wealth is laudable, the problem is how the tax code disperses the bulk of this spending. The support ends up going almost exclusively to the already wealthy, providing very little or no support to low and moderate income families, particularly those of color. Despite the IRS not collecting data on tax filers' race, in 2014, PolicyLink published a study that provided for the first time an approximation of which racial groups benefit most from tax expenditures. In it, researchers found that white households represented the majority of income earners in each income quintile, including in the top 3 quintiles. It is in these 3 income quintiles where a lion's share of available tax breaks were claimed, including exclusions, itemized deductions, and investment credits. An updated representation of those findings is depicted in the graphs that follow.